Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. We're excited to announce that registration for our fall cohort of the Next Economy MBA is officially open. Beginning September 30th, 2025, this 9-month facilitated learning journey was created for listeners like you, the entrepreneurs, artists, community leaders, and other folks on the front lines of the Next Economy movement. Based on our 15 years of experience working with over 500 different social enterprises, we'll explore the pitfalls of the business-as-usual economy and dive into key business principles from a regenerative and equity-centered lens, all while fostering the community and connection we need to stay resilient, inspired, and motivated in our movement to create a world that works for all of us. Interested in learning more? Join us for a free intro session where you can meet course facilitators and hear from alumni to determine if the program's a fit for you. Plus, you can save 20% on tuition when you register before August 11th during our early bird sale. Get started at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Thanks for listening. And now, onto the show.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy, and I'm joined today by Jason Wiener. Jason is the principal of the boutique law firm and business consulting practice, Jason Wiener P.C. And he's also co-founder of Colorado Cooperative Developers. Jason specializes in cooperative law, shared ownership models, cooperative finance, regenerative capital and financing strategies, sustainable economies law, teal lawyering, virtual outside general counsel, and worker ownership. Jason, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So Jason, maybe we could start with a bit about your background. How did you kind of come to this world of cooperative law, alternative ownership? What sort of led you in that direction earlier in your career?
I think the seeds of it were sowed in my upbringing and crystallized in college. I went to the Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations, which is a lot of words around kind of middle-class economics and the labor movement. And through college and law school, I was exposed to the kind of adversarial nature of labor rights, labor organizing, and labor law, how kind of we orient ourselves within organizations. And it felt very adversarial. It felt like the practice in the legal profession was about trying to limit or contravene power. And it felt very negative and opposing as opposed to affirmative and creative. And so in 2009, I stumbled into an opportunity to become the in-house general counsel of Namaste Solar, an employee-owned solar company. And it gave me this kind of lighthouse moment of addressing both the labor movement and the clean energy future at the same time in a really proactive and creative way. And I thought, this is the best of all things that I've been caring about and thinking about. So I went in-house and became a general counsel. And from there, really kind of hung a shingle to expand that practice nationally in many different sectors and many different company structures. And so took that show on the road.
Awesome. And yeah, I saw you served on the boards of things like Equal Exchange, which must be pretty cool to have served there.
Yeah, they're just an amazing company. So, nearly 40 years old, employee owned since the beginning, pioneered fair trade. I mean, they were breaking up or involved with some coffee that was held up at the ports in New Jersey in the mid 80s out of Nicaragua. So they were caught up in the whole Iran-Contra affair. Just some really interesting characters and really interesting model. Just goes to show that the cooperative model is relatively pervasive, if somewhat invisible.
Well, I think just for listeners, Jason and I had talked a little bit before we recorded about what we were going to talk about today. And one of the challenges that I've noticed in the next economy, building businesses that create an economy that works for all life, is you have these ideas of things like alternative ownership. So you might have something like a steward ownership, purpose trust, employee ownership, worker cooperative, but it's often less clear about what steps one would need to take to move towards those things. And so Jason is an expert in this and was kind enough to come on the podcast to talk about it. And so, Jason, maybe we could start at this sort of all the way upstream before you even get to the specific flavor of the ownership structure. What do you start thinking about at that early upstream stage about how you want to look into these different structures of alternative ownership?
Yeah, so there's really kind of two ways that I think business owners come to the possibilities around employee ownership or broad-based ownership. One is because they're beginning to practice or experiment with open book management, transparency, workplace engagement, and transformative, progressive workplace practices. So in some ways, they're trying to modernize and revolutionize workplace culture. That's usually one entree. The other is the beginning stages of succession planning. And we have a number of folks who are, still early in their careers, but are thinking long ahead, which is the right way to do it. Even if no pen gets to paper, to begin thinking about the future of the business is a really prudent thing to do. I think for most entrepreneurs, they're thinking about the likelihood of failure and not the possibility of success and being around in 20 years. And despite what they may have committed to in their formation documents, they're not really thinking about 10 years. They're thinking about the next product launch or the next stage. But I'd say half the time we get clients who are in their 30s, 40s, and they're thinking about the future and their lifestyle, and they may live more intentionally. The others are folks who are actually closer to retirement and they're thinking about succession. And usually the story goes that, they want to step back within 1 to 3 years. Maybe there's some other owners, but they don't want to just leave the business in fewer hands and rather more hands. Other times it's that the business is likely to just be shut down or gobbled up by private equity. I mean, that story, I can't tell you how many times I've heard, whether it's good times or bad times, private equity is almost always kind of a vulture in the sky swarming around looking for carcass. And whether it's a roll up or, it's a search fund, there's always something. And so business owners are often led to this through the realization that either their business is not conventionally sellable or they're motivated by something more than just maximizing the exit price. And very often that's just about an exit that aligns with their values and builds a legacy. And so, it's usually somebody who's trying to exit with intention.
And maybe we should also mention folks who are starting a business and want to do it the right way. Is that a whole nother track of this conversation? Or is there any advice you would give to those type of folks who are thinking about how do I set this up from the start?
Yeah, great. It's a little bit the same thing, but in reverse. We actually tell a lot of those folks, this is a balance. And if they're starting out employee owned, they're going to put a lot more time and energy and thought into a prescriptive framework for ownership and governance that may or may not be necessary. And so we often have to counsel people to simplify things a little bit and maybe even put off employee ownership until they ground sustainable business operations, become profitable, because that work may be for naught, or it may not end up being fruitful if the business can't ever get off the ground or it's not profitable. That's not a good candidate for an employee ownership model anyway. So I would say, yes, that's a third point. We rarely get those folks coming in thinking about the time after their life or their span with the business. It's more that they are looking to launch the business to be co-owned. And again, it's more typical founders thinking about setting up the business with their involvement in mind. They're not really thinking ahead toward the future. And with co-ops, we try to really promote simplicity and streamlining the launch and then staging complexity, stacking that as time goes on once they're sustainable and up and running.
Okay, so let's say we're in one of these situations where it's a going concern and the company is thinking about maybe they're not quite ready to retire, but they're sort of hey, I know I should be at least contemplating these things, but what is that next step of thoughtfulness, or like, what do you recommend people start thinking about at that stage?
Yeah, at that stage, I tell folks there is so much that can be done that is what I call pre-legal. It doesn't involve any change to the legal or ownership structure of the business. Often they should be talking to folks like you. They should be talking to folks who work in workplace engagement, high performing cultures. They should be doing organizational design work and pushing power to the edge, doing training to allow folks to be empowered to make better decisions, open book management, financial transparency. I also promote incentive alignments through profit sharing plans, gain sharing, and other kind of operational tools that can both create business ownership literacy, financial literacy, alignment of incentives, and improve engagement. There's just so much latent potential that goes untapped, and it's a missed opportunity to wait until the exit to unleash that. So I tell folks they need to experiment, not just do those things, but really experiment to see what works, because different employees are motivated by different things. You learn a ton as a business owner about the culture, what can be done differently, what can change, and how to maximize the worker ownership possibilities. And there could be specific interventions to go from, say, 30% interest to 70% interest. And you really need to be gathering that input before you structure an employee ownership transaction, because all too often owners have one idea about what that should look like. And then when they finally sit down to talk to their workers, they realize very few of them are interested. They want better pay and they want to go home and not stress about work. And the sooner one learns that, the better, because there's a lot that can be done to either try to kind of loosen that belief system or find different people or, improve workplace engagement through better pay. So all of these things are kind of variables on the dial.
It's fascinating that you mentioned people might just want a better pay and then go home. And like, we've seen that both internally we're a worker-owned cooperative, as you know, and other firms where there's this assumption, at least from me and maybe some of the partners, of like, everyone wants to be an owner, but then you might offer worker ownership to somebody and they're like, I don't know if I want to be a worker owner. Or so how do you even get to those conversations and like build that culture before a company's like, we're going to sell to the employees? I think that's
this is getting pretty deep into organizational psychology, which is, something that I'm very amateur at, but enjoy very much. I think a lot of that has to do with some of the baggage and programming we all show up with at work. Some of that is about a lack of safety and belonging in the workplace. And so there are these boundaries that are seemingly healthy, but predicated on a more extractive or concentrated power system. And we've seen this in our own work, that there can be a lot done to deconstruct those belief systems. There can be a lot done to instill a sense of belonging, safety, and openness, such that people do come forward with, hey, this is what motivates me. And you can see people really light up in different ways. And it may touch on attributes and qualities of ownership beyond pay. And you don't know that until you really invest in that process and invest in that work. And that is the beginning of the conversation around ownership. It's also the beginning of the conversation about maximizing people's potential and professional development. So all of these things that I'm describing that are pre-legal are extraordinarily positive return on investment decisions. You can't really be worse off for the wearer doing any of these things, because if worse comes to worse and a business owner opts for private equity, you've basically turned a much healthier business over that likely has higher profitability and less turnover. And so all of these things are good decisions, whether or not employee ownership exit is the route you go.
So let's assume I'm an owner who's like, I'm going to do some sort of employee ownership or broad-based ownership, and I want to know like what I should do. Like, what do you then tell someone who's like, okay, I've decided, we've maybe been doing some of these cultural things, we sort of have a little bit of momentum, but I'm still overwhelmed by the like alphabet soup of different options. How do you work someone through that point of the conversation?
That's the time when most folks go really deep into the rabbit holes of research and education. I think that much of that effort is it becomes counterproductive. At that moment, I think the most important thing is to build your team of outside consultants, outside advisors, and question whether your current advisors and professionals are knowledgeable enough to not only endeavor into that space, but support that pathway. Most of the time, the business owners, lawyers, CPAs, and financial advisors are not only ignorant to employee ownership, they're generally opposed to it. They think this is a bad idea. It won't be successful. That is absolutely the wrong alignment of support or fit. And I think the first thing is to go out and find consultants and advisors who are solution oriented toward employee ownership, but are not necessarily selling a specific pathway. So a lot of this is, again, around organizational development. A CPA and a lawyer don't necessarily need to be in the mix on day one, putting pen to paper. They need to be aware enough to support the non-traditional factors the business owner is going to come to them with, because that's what is leading this. This is not a financially maximizing decision, even if it's a lucrative outcome. And so you need to know that your professionals are at least supportive enough to design your pathway and support your pathway, considering non-financial factors. And so the very first thing is I'd be re-interviewing my team. I'd be talking to my management team and peers in leadership and deciding whether or not there's sufficient interest and support for all of the extra work that goes into it from an organizational standpoint. There are lots of professional organizations and consultants that support these learning processes and the feasibility analysis before making recommendations about the technical pathway. Is it this versus that? That actually should be a decision that comes later on. And it is largely kind of a mechanical or legal set of considerations. So for the business owner, I think really it's about finding the right team. It's also about just general succession readiness. So they need to have their ducks in a row, get your corporate documents ready, get your tax returns ready, identify what documentation there is around the business. All of that will be necessary, whether it's an employee ownership transition or a private equity transition, or whether or not you just start to analyze the business to see what's missing. And you might find you're not nearly as replaceable as you thought you were. That's usually one of the most critical factors, is how substitutable are you as owner, leader, manager. And if the business cannot function without you, generally speaking, you're not ready to even begin the logistical process of an employee ownership exit, because you've got to really train and identify successor managers and leaders. Those are really the first things to be doing. They can happen in tandem with some tax and financial planning, but those things are really most important. The second is to sit down and work with somebody to help you identify your goals, your objectives, your timeline, the transition pathway for you personally. Do I want to stay and continue working 2 years, 1 year? Am I willing to stay on as a consultant, or do I need to be cold turkey out of here in 6 months? What's my ballpark exit price? What do I need for retirement? What am I expecting out of this? Not just financially, but emotionally. That's really important. A lot of these transitions either kind of peter out or blow up because there's a lot of unspoken emotional currency that is kind of pent up in the valuation discussion. And a business owner really needs to be quite level-headed and clear-headed about what they want and by when they need it. Because if you need the exit price in order to live the retirement life that you want, you've got to be really clear about that, because it'll impact the company's ability to obtain financing. It'll directly impact the purchase price and the carrying capacity of the business after you leave.
It's just, I can see why somebody would just say, I'm just going to sell the business to private equity, because it's almost like you can bypass so much of these other conversations, even though you can't really, and it might make the company tank, as you said. But I think one of the like challenges in our world of convincing business owners to do this is just, you have to kind of be thoughtful and like build consent around certain things and like build your team and skill them up. And like, so I think there's just a lot of businesses and maybe business owners who feel like, I just thought I was going to do a employee ownership trust. I didn't know I had to do like all this other stuff in the meantime. Do you get that a lot when you talk to clients?
All the time. Yeah. Let me dispel that. Let's unpack that and I'll dispel it because that's really important. Number one, if you are so far along to be unwilling to invest in the preparation and the planning, you're pretty burnt out. And I have a ton of empathy and you need support. And the exit is not necessarily the only solution for that condition. Private equity is also not the right solution for that condition, because in most cases, private equity is offering, a fairly modest upfront cash out. And this is increasingly common with significant long-term earnouts. So most of the upside that a business owner expects is coming from future labor. And they don't realize that. What they don't realize is they often have given up all the control and power during that earnout. And most of that earnout is coming from enhancements to future profitability. So you're committing to certain profitability as a baseline. They expect that. That's why they're buying you. And they're going to give you a share of that future. So it's almost like you yourself have agreed to gain sharing for 2 to 5 years with non-competes and all the other things. And now you have turned yourself from a business owner into a middle manager. And you're working for a corporate holding company or conglomerate or whatever. The other thing is, due diligence is painstaking, laborious, anxiety-inducing. The most stressed out clients I have are those that are going through more traditional exits from an outside buyer who is relatively dispassionate and looking at your business objectively, warts and all, and is judging you. I can't tell you how emotional that is for business owners. It's such a gentler environment to be shaping the future of the business and co-creating that with people you care about. Now, the last thing I'll say, so I don't sound like too much of a proselytizer, is that if a business owner has put time, energy, and care into building the business to what it is today, one has to ask themselves what stands in the way of them just continuing that investment to achieve an outcome that is the most win-win-win available to them. They've already done most of the work. It's really more a matter of dueling the completion of the work that they've started. They're really helping to midwife the succession and transition. What holds a lot of people back is their unwillingness to give up control and decision-making. And so I find that as soon as that process begins, it actually snowballs quite easily. But it's about finding the right people. I mean, these are all the things that are necessary for the business to either be sustainable or to sell. The only time it's not necessary is when private equity is going to replace all your management, do it themselves, and largely extract value at the expense of workers. And for most folks who are looking at employee ownership, that's just not a viable option for them. So I would say, by and large, private equity is really not on the table of comparison. It's kind of apples and poison for them.
It's also, they're only looking for certain types of businesses. So I imagine
that's right.
If there's 100 businesses that come to you, there's probably 4 that are even like a good fit for like private equity, right? Because they have the growth or the profitability, et cetera. So I don't even think, it's not even an option for many people at Lift Economy. Sometimes people come to us like, we want to raise venture capital. We're like, whoa. There's so many things that need to happen before that. And that's a whole nother conversation. But really quickly on terminology for this conversation, I noticed you're using employee ownership or maybe broad-based ownership, and I was sort of saying alternative ownership. Is there like a proper way to think about how do you actually use the terms?
No. Unfortunately, there's no consensus on terminology here. So alternative ownership just simply means anything other than the traditional concentrated ownership or private equity capital-led ownership. Broad-based ownership I use intentionally to signify that something could be employee owned or it could be employee plus customer owned. It's broadly owned. Generally, that's done on a more kind of democratic basis, but broad in so much as it's owned by stakeholders. Most of the time in the employee ownership world, it's just the workers. But there are cases where a business could be co-owned between workers and customers or workers and vendors. Really, sky's the limit. And we don't want to get too caught up in the overwhelming degree of flexibility. But that is to say that there's such a broad range of possibility, and often our creativity, our consciousness just hasn't caught up to what's possible.
In terms of the decision to do this, so someone's saying, I want to go on one of these routes. I've heard others, like I think my business partner, Kevin, has said one of the challenging things for people is to do something like a worker co-op or maybe steward trust is you have to be willing to accept like less money. Is that actually true that you're going to maybe not have as big of an exit as you would otherwise? But again, like I guess we're saying how many companies are even getting a big quote unquote exit from private equity or something?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. So assuming, like you say, the premise we can accept here is that there's a private equity out, there's employee ownership, there's ESOP, there's other options. By and large, the data would support employee ownership entailing relatively concessionary pricing. But as you say, many of the businesses that convert to co-ops are non-marketable. In fact, I've read statistics that 80% of businesses under, I think it's $1 million in enterprise value, have no succession plan, and for whom there is no identified buyer. These are non-marketable businesses. So the two choices are employee ownership or shut down. It's not employee ownership or private equity. ESOPs are regulated and fair value has to be determined by a certified valuation. I think the bigger question to ask, and this is a topic for another podcast, is how on earth have private equity valuations become what they are? And why are they that way? Because that needs unpacking. To think that that's the threshold for fair market value is itself biased and erroneous. It's based on a calculated strategy of extraction that allows them to pay above what I think a reasonable or fair value is. So the market signifier, I think, is what we need to really scrutinize here. Co-ops, again, are generally not contenders for private equity. So yeah, and often the financing for that is mezzanine debt, seller financing, and the company's cash flow. Those are limiting factors. EOTs, it's the same thing. In fact, there's even less third-party financing available for employee ownership trust, steward trust. So by and large, it's seller financed. So there are significant financing hurdles, and the purchase price is slightly below what people think they can get. The big thing here is it's psychology. And as soon as one understands, again, comes to some reasonable understanding of the carrying capacity and reasonable projected cash flow of the business, the valuations tend to be a lot lower than business owners would like. And banks who are underwriting these mezzanine debt programs are fair and generally pretty sober about this. And I've seen a trend of those.
What is mezzanine debt, just for folks?
Intermediate. So it's not like credit card debt, but it's not senior secure debt like an SBA loan with first priority personal guarantees, all the rest. It's generally second priority secured debt.
Got it. So we started naming some of the types, ESOPs, EOTs, or employee-owned trusts. So maybe we should get into, so now you've got somebody who's either at the end and they're ready to go, or they're like, we're making good progress towards, now we want to know like, what are our actual options on the technical side? So where would you want to go with that?
So there's generally 4 species. One is a worker co-op, and that's a cooperative that is owned, governed by its workers. That could be employees only. That could be employees after a certain candidacy period. That could be employees and contractors. Again, some flexibility. Worker co-op. Another is an ESOP, which is what is conventionally or colloquially thought of as employee owned. That's an employee stock ownership plan. And we can go into these maybe. A third is an employee ownership trust, which is a colloquial name for a certain specific adaptation of a trust. The fourth is what we in Colorado have called alternative equity structures. So that could be an employee stock purchase plan that's non-qualified. It could be a broad-based corporation, broad-based LLC. It could be an LLC with profits interest. It's everything that's not those other 3, but is still broadly owned by workers or employees of the business.
And maybe we should just throw in how would benefit corporations fit into that or not?
Benefit corporations, at least in Colorado, operate as a layer on top of the corporate structure. So in Colorado, for example, and if you're a broad-based corporation, you can add the public benefit protections. If you're any of the cooperatives in Colorado, you can add the public benefit legal layer. In some states like Delaware, even LLCs can elect public benefit status. So you can have a public benefit LLC. You can't have that in Colorado, but you can in Delaware. There's a lot of complexity and technical detail to each of these. So for example, an ESOP is a specific type of qualified 401k. It's a specific type of qualified retirement vehicle that is tax advantaged, and it's a trust that owns some, most, or all of the corporate stock, but you still have an underlying operating corporation. That could be a public benefit corporation.
Yeah. Like maybe, well, for example, Lyft Economy, we're a California benefit corporation, but we operate like a worker-owned cooperative, even though they also, in California, they do have a legal form that I think is a California Cooperative Corporation. But I don't know if that was in place in 2014 when we converted. So I guess it's something to say is that there's a lot of different flavors within these 4 buckets, right?
Yes, there are. Yeah, I would say that's why I hesitated at calling each of these a species. It's more like there's 4 families, and taxonomically, each of them has several flavors and species. Once we get into that level of detail, there are some best practices, and it's a relatively financial, tax, and legal set of criteria that determine fit. And much of that is layered on top of, or is used to reflect, again, the broader financial and other goals and objectives of the client. And so I think it's often counterproductive to be thinking about the legal pathway too early, because that limits a lot of choice and it limits a lot of thought. And oftentimes we see that it's based on erroneous assumptions and information. And so I think it's best to really focus in kind of methodically, let that be driven by tax, finance, and legal considerations, because there's so many options and so much flexibility. But I see so many owners get so bogged down in learning everything about the different co-op types, the different EOT types. And, the truth is there's a lot of signal and noise, and there's really a lot of noise out there. A lot of the information is kind of synthesized and summarized case studies. And I often hear from folks who read case studies and they say, we want to go that route. But what they don't appreciate is that's an outcome. It was based on a set of interventions that was based on a set of criteria and factors. The criteria and factors are what are most influential, not outcomes. And we need to be pushing the field and pushing business owners to really focus on giving good input and information about themselves, their business, their objectives, their goals. And then we follow with 2 or 3 proposed interventions, how that impacts outcomes, but we really focus in on what's within our control. Outcomes are not always.
Yeah. Like I imagine people would come to you and say, I heard Patagonia did a purpose trust. We want to do that. And you're like, well, let's walk it back a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to pay $17.5 million in income tax to make that happen, or capital gains tax, or whatever they paid? Right. Exactly. There's a specific set of criteria that led to that decision. And by and large, we don't even know what those were, especially with the Patagonia case. All we saw with them is what we knew about the company before and what we know about it after. But for most people I've talked to, it's a complete black box as to how they went through that process and what they weighted and why. And that's the secret sauce. That's the magic.
So maybe for the next segment here, should we like walk through something like worker-owned cooperatives and like what do you have to think about to like go down that path, maybe pluses and minuses, and maybe take each of those?
Yep, absolutely. So as we kind of dive into the different types, I think of employee ownership, or at least we in Colorado think of it on a spectrum. And we have adopted the most generous, inclusive definition of employee ownership. Any company that's beneficially owned by its workers more than 20%. The going standard under the tax code and under the employee-owned certification is more than 30%. But we're trying to incentivize companies to go from venture level to 20%. And that's a big jump. 20% in our belief is a great starting point. You've shown up to the race, but it's not the end goal. So on that progression, there's a few different dimensions that we think of that differentiate a co-op from an ESOP from an EOT. And this gets into some fairly kind of technical aspects of ownership and governance. So a worker co-op is the most direct form of ownership for democratic worker governance and ownership, by which I mean that workers have a direct governance voice and a direct economic right into the decisions and profits of the company. They elect the board of directors directly. They have information and legal rights vis-a-vis decisions that are made. They are essentially the shareholders of the company. The key difference is they generally vote on a one member, one vote basis rather than based on how many shares they own or dollars they invested. Also, their financial return is based on their labor contribution, how much they work, not based on their capital contribution. But it's a direct form of ownership and it's democratic. I'd put that at one end of the spectrum. On the far other end of the spectrum, I would put an employee ownership trust. Why? An employee ownership trust, by and large, as I said, this is kind of a colloquial phrase for what is legally defined as a non-beneficiary, non-charitable trust. It has no legal beneficiaries. The employees of the company are not named. There's a purpose for which the trust is operated, and the trust, like an ESOP, owns some, most, or all of the shares of the operating company. But in the case of an EOT that owns 20% of the operating company, it only owns 20% of the stock, and that trust acts in furtherance of the stated purpose. That trust is designed and drafted and funded from a grantor or one or more of the owners of the company. But the trust doesn't benefit directly and is not governed directly by employees. They have no legal right to the assets or decisions of the trust. They can have rights in certain instances based on the design of the trust through what's called the Trust Protector Committee and the trustee. But if you have a minority trust that owns 20% of the stock of the operating company, you still have 80% of the shareholders that may choose to prioritize financial gain and outcome. And in fact, could still sue the board of directors for acting in advance of the purpose and not financial return. So at a minimum, an EOT should make sure the operating company is structured as a public benefit corporation so that it can align those two purposes. And by and large, the EOT should, in my view, own at least a majority of the operating stock to control the board. But the EOT is what we call beneficial ownership. And it's even indirect there because it doesn't, if you dissolve the trust, it doesn't turn its assets over to named individual employees. It's to advance the interest of employees or whatever is identified as a purpose. And that could be anything. They're not charitable. They're not tax exempt. It could be anything. There's no legal standard. There's no legal test for an EOT. It's not legally defined anywhere. They're actually, again, species constructs under historically dynastic trust law, and in some cases, charitable trust law, but we generally form them under states that allow non-charitable, non-beneficiary trusts. The three going jurisdictions are Oregon, which has a purpose trust statute, North Dakota, which allows perpetuity, and Delaware, which allows perpetuity and purpose trusts. In the middle are ESOPs and these other forms of direct or beneficial ownership. And an ESOP, well, I'll pause there and then we can deep dive into any of the others.
So when you say employee-owned trust, it doesn't necessarily have to benefit the employees. It could just be like, it could be environmental benefit, like Patagonia's thing.
Like Patagonia. So an EOT is actually a flavor of a steward trust or a purpose trust.
Got it.
So the most accurate description is to call these purpose trusts. That's the most descriptive. An employee ownership trust is actually a misnomer because the trust is not owned by employees. And it's just a flavor of a purpose trust, the purpose of which is to advance the interests of employees. By and large, what that means is to maintain a bonus program for employees. But it is not to confer ownership to employees. It's to confer certain aspects of ownership to employees.
Right. And so if you had a employee-owned trust, or you wanted to set up a purpose trust or employee-owned trust, is that similar to, and maybe we should go into ESOPs next, but is it similar to ESOPs where it's like, I don't recommend it unless you're at least 30 to 50 employees or like it's a bigger company? Okay.
No, they're very different. ESOPs are highly regulated creatures of the Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 1976 or 74. EOTs are by and large, they're unregulated. They're far more flexible. They're creatures of state law, whereas ESOPs are creatures of federal law. EOTs are also creatures of state trust law, which make them fairly arcane and complicated, but they are also the product of very, very, very complicated tax rules. And this is where business owners need to find the right tax advisors and legal partners, because the design of the trust and the design of the transaction to the trust is incredibly sensitive to capital gains tax, income tax, gift tax, and estate tax. And the consequences can be hugely consequential and can actually create liability, not just for trustees, but even for employees themselves. And so the EOT is just in this milieu of kind of emerging as a strategy, but it doesn't have a lot of clear rules. On the other hand, the ESOP is very much the opposite. Tons of clear rules, tons of regulation. And that is a double-edged sword. There's a lot more predictability, but there's also a lot more rigidity. So the ESOP—
why don't you go into ESOPs?
ESOPs are, as I said, they're qualified, which means they're tax-advantaged retirement plans. An ESOP is essentially a 401k plan that, unlike requiring portfolio investments, actually allows for the trust to only invest in one company, the operating company, the holding company. So an ESOP is like a 401k that's only invested in the employer. It has a trustee who is a fiduciary, meaning they owe a duty of care to the beneficiaries of the plan. The plan are named identified employees who qualify through some tenure. They earn shares in the plan, and those shares vest over time, and they get reallocated over time based on annual valuations of the shares held in the trust. The ESOP trust is a trust, and it acquires and owns shares of the operating company, and they have to be valued every year. and it operates a lot like a retirement plan. So it's subject to, 401k rules. And a lot of these companies that are successful and profitable are accruing significant value in these ESOPs that becomes payable when an employee retires and is open to distributions. Now, ESOPs have significant tax advantages. The seller to an ESOP qualifies for a capital gains deferral on the sale price. And ESOPs there's this specific type of ESOP that's 100% ESOP, and the operating company is an S Corp. They pay no income tax. They are effectively tax exempt organizations because the S Corp earnings of the company flow through to the trust, and the trust is a tax exempt trust entity and pays no income tax. And so the cash flow benefits of an ESOP transaction often justify their creation, which can be much more expensive than the other models. The rule of thumb is that they can cost $200,000 to $500,000 to set up, and they can be $50,000 to $150,000 a year to administer. But based on tax credits that are available in certain states like Colorado, and based on the cash flow benefits of not paying federal income tax, that often will make this a very clear financial proposition for a lot of business owners. And as a result, there's a whole cottage industry that's gotten set up around ESOPs, from investment bankers to advisors to CPAs to law firms. And so those tend to be fairly transactional arrangements, whereas the EOT and the worker co-op, they tend to be a little bit more supported, kind of high touch interventions in the company.
And maybe it's worth talking about, since we're on ESOPs, tell me if this is correct, but I've heard one of the challenges with ESOPs is, let's say you have 250 employees and 30 employees want to retire one year. Suddenly the company has to pay out the sort of payment of these 30 employees. So that can be like really burdensome on the cash flow of the company. And the other thing I've heard is it doesn't necessarily protect the company's purpose forever. So you could, like, I think New Belgium Brewery, for example, like, didn't they have an acquiring Japanese brewer that came in, and they were 100% employee owned, but they still probably had a fiduciary duty or something to, like, I don't know, maybe you could speak to some of the downsides. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first part of your comment, there's something called a repurchase obligation. So the ESOP, like a 401k plan, owes a duty to its beneficiaries that upon qualifying events, retirement, for example, they repurchase the shares the employees hold in the trust. That's like buying out their balance in a 401k plan. Now, most businesses that convert to ESOPs will go through regular financial planning to manage that redemption liability, and they will have balance sheet sinking funds and financing available to plan for that. Where things become problematic is when the company doesn't plan properly, or they aren't on top of kind of demographic indexing of their workforce, aging workforce, et cetera. So that is absolutely a problem. And, this is a good problem to have, though, because it means there was so much profitability that went into the trust asset base that they now have to find ways to come up with the cash to pay that. That's, in fact, the benefit of the bargain that the ESOP offered. And there are plenty of ESOPs that manage redemption liabilities without it sinking the ESOP. But for a lot of ESOPs that are also trying to grow and use their cash flow for growth or working capital, it can be quite difficult. I don't know any inside baseball at New Belgium Brewing, but I suspect that's what was happening. They had just opened a new location brewery in Asheville, North Carolina. They were growing fast. I don't know what their repurchase liability is. So they were looking at, some stark financial realities. There is some law in the Department of Labor regulations and in case law governing the fiduciary duty of ESOP trustees that lead trustees generally to believe they owe a duty like a traditional director to maximize the benefit to the plan beneficiaries. There is some flexibility that can be put into ESOP documents to balance that. But by and large, what the trustee's role there is to do is to maximize. These are also the same duties, by the way, that financial advisors have to their clients. to maximize the financial benefit to beneficiaries. So the trustee is actually making a balanced determination that the transaction and not the rejection of the transaction is in the best financial interest of the plan beneficiaries. And so that has a lot to do with looking at future cash flows and financing ability. So it's not maybe as simple as saying they were compelled to do it by traditional fiduciary duties. It's more that they had to look at all factors and consider the best interests of the plan beneficiaries. With that said, there are certain protections and there are things that can be done to help preserve company purpose, but not completely remove the possibility of a sale. I will say no business of any kind should ever believe that perpetual purpose is protected, even in a purpose trust. And this is coming from somebody who drafts documents that are intended to survive long term. It's just impossible to predict the feasibility of a purpose in perpetuity. And as it turns out, business entities, organizations were never really designed for perpetuity. I'm constantly reminded from my law school days that there is this general common law doctrine called the prohibition against unreasonable restraints on alienation. In the law, there's a general discomfort with tying up assets in perpetuity to prevent them from being transferable or disposable forever. This has actually made its way into trust law, which is this notion of dead hand control. The law doesn't like when the Rockefellers can lock up billions and billions in wealth in a trust and control it from the grave. So the law developed something called the rule against perpetuities. And it was a rule that is now being eroded in state after state, which basically says that courts have the authority to break up a trust after a certain amount of time because they don't like when assets are inalienable for too long. And so to think that an ESOP or an EOT or a co-op should exist with a purpose codified on paper forever belies history and any degree of pragmatism. Same is true for our Constitution. Interpretations are changing. It's been amended 27 times. We should be thinking the same thing about business entities.
And so maybe we could turn to the purpose trust then from that. Like, what are the upsides and downsides that you've seen on that model?
So the upside for an EOT is that it is very flexible for the wishes of the granting owner, the grantor as it's called. The owner can make a grant of his or her their equity ownership into the trust, and they can lay the purpose out to be whatever they want. They can create this synthetic governance structure that allows for decision-making through a trustee and a trust protector committee. They even include something called a trust enforcer, which is a role that can hold the trust accountable. So the trust is very, very adaptable. And the trust can be structured in a few different legal varieties to optimize for tax efficiency. So there's a variety of ways that the transactions are taxed. There's a variety of ways trusts can be created. And as I said earlier, they're very sensitive to the tax situation of the seller and the tax situation of the company and how the trust operates. So they're very flexible. The downside is they've only been around in the US for 5 or 6 years, and there have been no IRS rulings challenging or opining on how these things are taxed. And so it's a little bit of blue sky without a lot of guidance. And so we don't know exactly how these things will operate in the long term, over the long haul. Another downside is that they've become so popular so fast. There's a lot of productizing that's happening. There's a lot of, groups selling EOTs in kind of standardized fashion. And when you don't have much guidance on the tax side or even on the legal side, and they're inherently complex, that's generally a recipe for disaster. That's a lot of risk to take on as a business owner and as employees as well. But by and large, these things can be worked through, and just a matter of getting the right people to thoughtfully prepare these things. But they're also not nearly as expensive to set up as an ESOP. The rule of thumb is that they're a third to a half as expensive, and they require no ongoing valuation and very low cost administration. Many of them have inside trustees, so the fees are negligible to run them. Downside also is that they're hard to finance. I've heard that by and large, most EOTs are seller financed. And further, that
when you say seller finance, does that mean like, what does that mean?
That means the seller will take a note from the trust or from the company and will be paid back out of the operating cash flows of the company.
And the seller is usually like the business owner?
The exiting business owner. That's right. Yeah. So I'm hearing in a lot of these transactions that the seller is taking a note for most, if not all, of the purchase price. And until they are repaid, most of these trusts are not making any bonus distributions to employees. So in some cases, the purported benefit of the trust isn't actually materializing until the seller is paid out. And in some cases, that's 5 or 10 years.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to ask if I'm a business owner and I actually want to do something like create a trust. It sounds like, and how would that look? Like, let's say I have a $20 million widget business. Is it like I have to come up with the full value of like the revenue of the company for a year? Like, how are you determining what the sale price is? And then like how would that company come up with that money?
I've heard that it's sometimes just declared by the business owner. In some cases, I'm hearing in other cases, there's a quasi negotiation between the selling owner and outside consultants who help shape and model out the purchase price and the financing. The most responsible way is to get some sort of valuation or appraisal, because also that will be helpful for tax purposes to challenge any audit or IRS challenge. Ultimately, these are transactions that the IRS could scrutinize. And if the value is too low, that could be taxable to the trust. If it's too high, it could be taxable. There's a variety of ways. So, this is not unusual for estate planning folks, but it is somewhat unusual because you don't actually have a buyer, right? That's what's also different about the EOT. There is no human being acting as a buyer. There is no buyer here. The trust is receiving something often for nothing up front. With the ESOP, you have a buyer in the regulated rules determining how value is. That's why there's a certified valuation, and the Department of Labor has been very active to scrutinize these valuations. It's to protect employees. With worker cooperatives, you have a buyer. It's the workers. Their steering committee reviews financials, acts on behalf of the future co-op, negotiates that sale price. EOTs have no arm's length transaction. So that can be modeled out, but I think there needs to be more guidance. Oh, the other point I wanted to make is EOTs, those things, that is a term of art in the UK and in Australia and other jurisdictions. But in those jurisdictions, especially in the UK, the EOT is equivalent to our ESOP. There's a lot of misunderstanding. Their version of an employee ownership trust looks nothing like the US version of an employee ownership trust. It looks more like an ESOP. So for folks doing your homework out there, yeah, it's like the spelling of labor.
Yeah. And so on the worker ownership side, would you say that that's the least common just because of the perceived challenges of like making everyone an owner and like the belief that like you need consensus on everything? How do you see worker ownership and popularity compared to these other options?
I think it has a niche market for sure. Folks generally really want it or they're closed off to it. But I find that much of it actually appeals to more people when they get to know a little bit more about how flexible it can be. So again, a lot of these inbound inquiries are based on some preconceived notions and sometimes some false information. But yeah, I'd say the co-op is probably the most niche. And that is often based on, I don't want everybody having to decide everything. Not everybody is capable or wants to be an owner. Those are the two most common bits of feedback I hear.
Yeah, because I think Namaste is actually a good example of a worker-owned cooperative where it's it's one worker, one vote, but there's also like a CEO and an executive team that's running. So it's not like everyone is the CEO and like everyone's running the company and making, there's just chaotic decisions being made everywhere. What were some of the governance components that Namaste set up to allow that maybe more flat worker-owned cooperatives don't have?
Well, so that goes back to this pre-legal exercise I was talking about earlier. When I was there, we went through the conversion. We were always employee-owned, but converted to a co-op in 2000, I think 11, early 11, late 2010. And much of it was to align the legal structure with how we actually operated. And we did a lot of work around decision zone charts and creating a whole matrix of influence, decision, ratification. And we listed out, every organ and role in the company and who had what rights. And those were operational. That didn't show up anywhere in the bylaws. And as things would have it, most of the field has adopted a similar approach to creating decision zone charts and matrices. And it's to be really intentional and strategic about governance. And contemporary co-op governance actually looks quite a lot like the best of corporate governance. Well-trained boards, onboarding, a ton of investment in financial and business literacy for owners. But by and large, the management and executive team are making the high-level decisions under the board's supervision. And the board is an oversight, big picture kind of policy setting organ. And the members are kind of a backstop. But even those organizations are yet further working to push power out to the edges, to job roles. So there's actually this possibility for really virtuous cycle of decisions being pushed out to the edges, to job roles, but the ultimate backstop on the big decisions coming back to those same workers as owners in an ownership capacity. But where most decisions get made is still at the strategic, leadership and executive level, where there's technical expertise and job role kind of domain focus.
So maybe in the last 10 minutes or so, what else do you want listeners to know about these choices? Like what else haven't we touched on? What else do you think is important for folks to know about this?
I think, we've talked for 45, 50 minutes, and I would presume listeners are thinking, wow, this sounds overwhelming. There's a lot to know. This sounds really hard. I want listeners to know that this is worth it. There's an opportunity to engage and create a microcosm of organizational democracy and a healthy democratic outlet outside of dysfunctional political democracy, and to leave a legacy and reward the people that have helped build the business to what it is today. Most of what we've talked about are not things that the business owner or the employees need to study up on and get a master's degree in. This is largely the domain of professional expertise, and having the right guidance and coaching will help make these decisions at the right time in a really streamlined way. But for a lot of folks, this is the culmination of their work. This is not a new kind of annoying undertaking. The next thing is engage your employees, be sensitive to what you're willing to share. But I often find owners have come up with a whole plan before they've ever even talked to their workers. And I can't impress upon business owners enough that, yes, there's a time and a place, but you've got to engage the workers if this is going to be meaningful. There are ESOP companies that will go full ESOP, and many times their employees don't even know they're in an ESOP. It's just a retirement planning vehicle, or they don't even know that the transaction has happened. And I think that's not possible with co-ops, but this is an opportunity to co-create. It's an opportunity to distribute the workload. It's an opportunity to help transition you out of the role that you're trying to transition from, and engaging your stakeholders, your employees, earlier rather than later can be really, really helpful and take a lot of the pressure off.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think what we've seen at Lyft as well, even in our own worker co-op, is there's the ownership structure, which you've spoken extensively about, and then the governance, which we've also touched on, and even maybe layer down is accountability, because you can have a really brilliant ownership model of like a worker cooperative or employee owned trust that's beautifully set up. But if people aren't accountable and their things are falling through the cracks, and you're not going to get all the benefits of these ownership models. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I'd go even further. These things can also be counterproductive. I've seen transactions where without enough structure and mentorship and investment in training, this becomes just a complaint box. And employees think they're entitled to whine and complain to the CEO and go straight to the board. I mean, I've seen this can cause chaos and dysfunction. And often it can expose the weaknesses of the organization. So, like I said, all that pre-legal work is kind of an insurance policy as well as an investment. And you're right. It's not just that you don't get the benefits. I think in many cases, it can actually be detrimental.
Well, one, I want to just ask if there's a point where you think, it's hard to know, but is there a point where the pre-legal work is done sufficiently that they could then turn to someone like you, or like who could then help on the legal side? Or how do someone know when like they've done enough of the sort of preceding pre-legal work?
I think that if the owner's got a reasonable basis for the sale price, with their documents put together in a package, they have begun experimenting with some organizational development practices, open book management. They have whatever feedback from their employees that there's sufficient interest, and they've gotten even some tax advice on the sale price and financing. It can't hurt to get at least even an initial conversation with a lawyer. Here's what we're thinking. Here's what this looks like. Here's what that looks like. And even here's where we're leaning. We like this about this and that about that. As soon as you have kind of a high level business plan, exit plan, I think it's time to get some advice and feedback. And then very often that will just be kind of confirmation. And then it's really about doing the work. If you've got consultants, you'll be doing some training and deeper design around organizational decision making. And, you might have some financing you need to line up. There's usually a couple months worth of work that happens before you go back to the lawyer to say, we're ready. Sometimes that happens in tandem.
And we've talked about a lot of different things, and I'm not sure if you have a sort of, here's the summary steps of like Jason's 5 easy steps to employee ownership. I don't think you need that. But like, could you just rehash, here's what I recommend you do first, just so folks can leave with like, here are the steps that they can kind of think through this process on?
Number one is personal planning. What's your retirement going to look like? What do you need for retirement? Emotional preparation, financial preparation, it's personal work. Number two is putting an offer together, beginning to line out your purchase price, your timeline. What are you willing to do in the meantime? Job role change, et cetera. 3 is organizational preparation, business documents, get all your legal documents, tax returns. Somewhere in that same vein, maybe number 4 is organizational development. Start engaging your leadership team, start engaging employees, start surveying and getting input from folks on interest. Number 4 would be consult with experts. And that's lawyer, tax accountant. Maybe you have a business coach. Maybe you hire an outside employee ownership consultancy. You're going to do a lot of stage 5. You're going to do a lot of kind of design work. And that's preparatory and structure, feasibility analysis, confirming your plan. And then I think not the final step, step 6 would be execution. Begin to draft legal documents, line up financing, arrange to do the transaction. Step 7 is the most important, which is commit to the ongoing investment in the decision and transaction you've undertaken. Commit to the ongoing pursuit of workplace democracy, workplace engagement. Train your directors, train people in financial literacy, train your new employees in the business model, and prepare people to be responsible, engaged owners.
See, Jason, 7 easy steps. We got it. Jason, is there anything you need? One of the things we ask guests on the show is there anything that you need right now, and how can the listeners support your work?
Well, we'd love to hear from any businesses that are considering going this route or are ready to design their transaction. What we need is for folks to really sit down and do the hard work first, and maybe avoid the checklists, avoid the technical exploration. I think that often masks over the important information that I and other technical professionals are looking for when somebody comes to us. They may have done some of that, but what we need are people who have done that personal work and have done some of the organizational planning, and that has informed their trajectory and preferences. That's incredibly helpful when folks call. They said, we've tried this, we've done that, and we've learned from it, and here's why we want to do what we want to do. That is hugely helpful.
Got it. So it's not just, my first thought is I want to do an EOT and I call Jason. It's just, you're going to be less able to really help because they haven't really done any of those earlier steps. Okay. Want to drop contacts, email, could drop email or any socials or, website for folks to follow you on.
Yeah, we'll drop our LinkedIn page in the show notes. We can put the website there. There's plenty of ways to contact us and sign up for our newsletter. There's really good content there. We send a newsletter out once a month. We're often referencing Lift Economy projects and activities, so you'll see some overlap, but lots of other stuff as well. And would also just love to hear from folks in the field. So feedback, questions, concerns. I'm always up for a rich discussion. So if anything kind of stirred you up or struck a chord or, anything I've said that resonated, I'd love to hear that.
Awesome. Well, great, Jason. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and we'll have to have you back on to get more into the weeds on this one.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Thanks to Lift Economy.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation and are looking to dive even deeper into the B Corp movement, you'll love our new podcast, Beyond the B, hosted by Lift Economy's Amy Allison and me, Ryan Honeyman. Beyond the B is your insider's guide to the B Corp movement. You'll learn about the new B Corp standards shaping our community, how the B Corp movement is navigating the various tensions and challenges of growth, and how businesses like Patagonia are putting their commitments to people and planet in practice. Check out our latest episodes and free resources at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can also subscribe to Beyond the B on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. I'm Anayana White, a Lift Economy Next Economy MBA alum and the head of communications at the American Sustainable Business Network, ASBN. ASBN is on a mission to connect and mobilize sustainable business leaders for a just and regenerative economy, and has launched a nationwide Tell Your Story campaign. Legislators and media are reaching out to ASBN for the stories and insights into how businesses are being affected by the current administration's policies. Do you have a story to tell? Use our guiding questions to craft and tell your story today at bit.ly/ASBN Tell Your Story. And find out more about our areas of impact and membership at asbnetwork.org.